Good morning. Thank you very much for the introduction. I understand that you typically don't have politicians speak to you, I think is the case, and I don't blame you for that. I'm hoping that what I can do today, and I thought a lot about what I would actually present here. We certainly have been doing resource extraction in BC for a long time, and I've been mines minister 3 times, so I know a little bit about the mining industry. In my current role, I'm also responsible for BC Hydro and our other utilities and renewable energy, so it's certainly a good fit for me. But nonetheless, I still felt a little bit boxed into perhaps trying to talk about things that I don't know as much about, and I decided not to do that. I'm just going to tell you our story from BC on mining and renewable energy, and I hope that it's useful to you and that you can, you'll draw your own conclusions from our story. I want to start here this morning by quoting from an article I came across just about a week ago, and the article claims that the rest of the world is leaving us behind here in Canada in terms of getting industry onto electricity, and of course having that electricity be clean and green. And I know if we're standing in Ontario and I'm from BC, it's totally different situations. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that. The evidence provided in the article for Canada to be lagging behind Europe in particular is a recitation of how some of the European countries are doing at converting their electricity source from fossil and nuclear sources to renewable sources, and the author used some stats from Germany, for example. He said, and I'm going to quote, from a standing start at Kyoto in 1997, Germany pledged to source more than 80% of its electricity from renewable resources by 2050. They're already on track to surpass 40% renewables by 2020, so they're obviously doing well. Spain, 2013, wind surpassed nuclear to become the country's most important energy source at 21% of the power sector. Even better, advances in wind are allied with increased output from solar, so that nearly 50% of Spain's electricity was produced from renewables in 2013. On to Portugal. Portugal posted even more impressive gains this decade, actually producing more than 70% of the country's electricity from wind and hydro during the first quarter of 2014. And then the final quote I wanted to give you from that article: renewable energy is a competitive advantage. Virtually every major economy is investing heavily in renewables to save the planet and put people to work, except Canada and Australia. And I'm not here to take on the author in terms of his point of view, but I wanted to start with that. You all know that kind of discussion is taking place right now around the world. So how does that picture from Europe stack up against what we're doing in British Columbia? Well, the fact of the matter is that in British Columbia, our electricity is already over 93% clean and renewable, and we also have a legislated commitment that BC will meet at least 66% of our new incremental demand growth with efficiency and conservation measures. So we're well down the road and beyond the stats that I just quoted for you. BC leaders many years ago, many decades ago actually, decided with good reason that it made the most sense for us in BC to exploit the hydroelectric opportunities that we have given our topography and climate. Starting in the 1950s and 60s, BC developed large storage hydro projects on 2 rivers mainly. One is the Columbia River, which is where I live, and one is the Peace up in the northeast part of the province. BC's vast network of transmission and distribution lines transmit power across the province to our mining, our forestry, and our natural gas industries from a generation system that, as I said a second ago, is 93% clean and green, with only a very small fraction of capacity and energy coming from a few gas turbines scattered around the province in strategic locations. The largest of those gas turbine plants, Burrard Thermal, is being phased out. 25% of our electricity in BC is or will very soon be from privately owned facilities, predominantly renewables. The rest is from large hydroelectric, mainly BC Hydro. BC Hydro, our public utility, is investing right now about $2.4 billion a year into new and upgraded generation and transmission assets so that we can retain and enhance the reliability of our system. We don't have, and I touch wood when I say this, we don't have brownouts in BC. The lights went out about a month ago because of a major windstorm. It was actually a record windstorm in the Vancouver area, and 710,000 BC Hydro customers lost access to their electricity. That's a lot of people. 99% of those were reconnected in 72 hours. Everybody was reconnected within 5 days, so the utility does a pretty decent job for being a monopoly. That capital plan includes very large annual investments, as I said, in both generation and transmission. Just to give you some sense, I don't know who here knows much about BC, but just to give you a sense of where we're investing the money on the Columbia River, the Mica Dam, we've got Mica Units 5 and 6, a $714 million project. Up on the Peace, the GM Shrum, that's an existing hydroelectric, well, they're both existing hydroelectric facilities. Units 1 to 5 at GM Shrum, $272 million replacement. We announced roughly a year ago that Site C, the third dam on the Peace River, would go ahead. If you want to understand why we made the decision to build another hydroelectric project, I guess one of the ways you can look at it is to look at how successful large hydro has been in BC, where we find that we have the third lowest residential rates in North America and relatively cheap electricity from these large facilities that were built in some cases 50 years ago. So we're going to build another one on the Peace River. As I say, it's the third one. And what Site C will give us is 35% of the electricity that's currently generated at the WAC Bennett project, with only 5% of the environmental footprint. So it was a very advantageous situation, having the option to be able to build a large hydro project like that. And I should say, because I'm sure many in the audience who are interested in renewables, that this will be the last large dam that we'll build in BC. We have legislated ourselves into that position. We made the decision to build Site C. We're going to proceed with it. In fact, we're proceeding with it right now. It's being built. But that will be the last big dam built in our province. Transmission, in terms of those $2.4 billion a year capital investments, we just put $725 million into something called the Interior to Lower Mainland project. That's to help us meet load growth and also reliability. It was a 247-kilometer transmission line, 500 kV line, and by next year we'll have 5 major transmission lines, 500 kV lines coming into the Lower Mainland, which will obviously assist on the reliability side of things. We're also building a line up in the Dawson Creek-Chetwynd area. That's in the northeast part of our province. That's where all this natural gas is that you've heard about. It's a $300 million transmission line. It's going to provide clean electricity to the upstream oil and gas sector. There's also 2 proposed lines in northeastern British Columbia that are not off the drawing board yet. We have to make a final decision. We've made the decision to build them. We don't know exactly whether I'm going to order our Utilities Commission to just allow them to be built, or whether they're going to go through a Utilities Commission process. But the purpose of these 2 new lines, proposed lines, are to deliver electricity to the companies that extract natural gas in northeastern BC and give them the option to choose electricity as opposed to using natural gas. And they essentially have all said to us, if the electricity is there, we'll use it. So that is, those are 2 projects that I'm quite sure will go ahead. We also concluded about a year ago a big transmission line project in northwestern British Columbia called the Northwest Transmission Line. My friend, the leader of the opposition in British Columbia, the NDP opposition, refers to it as a power line to nowhere, but in fact it actually services a brand new copper gold mine, Red Chris, which was a very important development for us in BC. That mine wouldn't have proceeded without the transmission line. It also feeds in AltaGas's Forest Kerr Renewable project, Run of the River project, which is one of the largest renewable projects that we have. So we've got electricity, clean electricity coming into the line and clean electricity going out of the line to Red Chris. Bruce Jack Mine was just announced not too long ago. Predovan Resources, or Predovan Mining, has that project, and they're also going to be taking electricity off the Northwest Transmission Line. There is a project called KSM, a very large project, plus $5 billion project up in that neck of the woods that, if built, would take electricity from the Northwest Transmission Line. Kitsault is another project. I met with the owners of that project this morning. All of these projects would be fed by the Northwest Transmission Line instead of being on diesel. We have in BC, in fact, only one mine that's not currently attached to our grid, and that's a mine on Vancouver Island, a relatively small mine, and it's located in a fairly new provincial park, and so there was a decision made not to put a transmission line to that one. All the rest of our operating mines in BC are attached to the grid, and all of the major projects, except a couple, if they go ahead, would also have access to the grid. There are obviously situations where mines are proposed and they're a long ways from your transmission lines, and there's a choice for companies as to what they're going to do. We've invested a lot in transmission in BC. We're going to continue to do that because we actually want everybody to be on the grid, and we don't want mines, frankly, using diesel unless it's the only choice that there is. So let me talk a little bit about, see if I can make this work, a little bit about private renewable power. Aside from large hydro, BC has significant input from renewable IPPs. We've been developing power from run-of-the-river hydro, wind, biomass at unprecedented levels in recent years, and as I said a minute ago, we're up to about 25% of our total electricity coming from private renewables today. That industry started in BC in the 1980s, but it was pretty slow going until, in fact, until our government was elected in 2001, and the Premier at the time, Gordon Campbell, had a vision for developing a private renewable power industry and established several policies. I'm going to tell you about a few of them here today to get that industry kick-started. We started that roughly in 2002 with the introduction of our 2002 energy plan that was called Energy for Our Future, a plan for BC. We stipulated that the private sector would develop all new electricity generation, and BC Hydro would invest in its existing plants. Site C was the exception to that. In 2007, we announced our BC Energy Plan, a vision for clean energy leadership, and that led to BC Hydro issuing 2 calls for power, one in 2007 and one in 2008. And then in 2010, we passed something we call the Clean Energy Act, which provided regulatory certainty by exempting electricity purchase agreements from the BC Utilities Commission approval, so that they didn't have to go through that process. And by doing those things, plus some other things I don't have time to talk about, we created a new industry. But I think it's important for me as I go out and talk about our situation in BC to also say that that to some extent that came with the cost, and investing in new technologies I think always does come with the cost borne by shareholders and investors, but also by the taxpayer. Increasingly, the cost of wind power has come down, and I would say in BC that wind is probably at the top of the list in terms of what is likely to proceed, at least in the near to midterm, as opposed to the run-to-the-river projects that we built 10 years ago, and we're still building a few of them now. Solar is just getting started in BC. We have our very first solar farm that feeds into our grid. It's actually pretty close to where I live, not far from Kimberley and Cranbrook. I'll tell you a little bit about that in a second. Tidal, geothermal, both still very early days. We have an MOU, BC has an MOU with Nova Scotia on the development of tidal resources, and we're going to try to find ways to help those folks that are interested in that proceed with their investigations. We're struggling to identify a business case for geothermal resources in BC, and I listened to Ross Beattie's speech. Ross was here last year, and so I wanted to know what he had to say, and so I watched his speech on the internet, and he talked a little bit about geothermal, and I know Ross has actually personally invested in the development of geothermal in BC, and he mentioned last year the challenge in terms of finding the right kind of resource. Obviously, in some parts of the world, geothermal works quite well, like Iceland, and we know we've got We've got places where the rocks are hot in British Columbia. There's several places that have been identified, and there's been some, some effort to develop those resources, and a fair bit of money spent, tens of millions of dollars spent trying to develop those resources, and it's been, I think, a little bit disappointing to the developers so far, and we haven't had a geothermal project come forward in any of our power calls or through our what we call our standing offer program, which allows you to go to 15 megawatts without, as long as you can sign an energy purchase agreement with BC Hydro, you can go to 15 megawatts, and we haven't had any geothermal projects come through that program either. Bioenergy or biomass has been used by a lot of our forest companies, a lot of the pulp mills in particular. It ends up displacing load in most situations, but in every case it enhances the business case for the pulp and paper industry, the forest industry, which is challenged these days. So it has benefits from two different points of view. So we kick-started this private renewable industry in 2002, and we consider ourselves a leader in clean energy in BC. I often read in the national media stories that talk about what's happening in Ontario and what's happening in Quebec, and never mention BC. They should mention BC because we've had a lot of good things going on and a lot of good policies in lots of ways, policies that were created before anywhere else in the country. Between 2001, when we were first elected, to today, private sector renewable energy projects increased from 4% then to 25% today. So there's been good growth. BC Hydro has more than 100 contracts right now with IPPs in operation today, and they've got a few more that are going to be built out. Wanted to tell you a little bit about some policies that are not electricity focused. In addition to having 93% clean or renewable electricity in BC and kick-starting that renewable power industry, we have created these other policies to help our resource and transportation industries clean up their non-electricity fuels. We've got something called the Renewable, it's through my ministry, called the Renewable and Low Carbon Fuel Requirements Regulation. It reduces our reliance on non-renewable fuels, establishes a market for low-carbon fuels, reduces GHG emissions, and contributes to the low-carbon economy. They're targets essentially for the companies that manufacture fuel, gasoline and diesel. There's a measurement for carbon intensity and then overall content. These targets have been argued about quite vociferously over the last 5 years or so, and we've essentially, after looking at it very carefully and talking to the oil and gas companies and to the folks that on the renewable side, we're going to stick to the targets that we have. We also, secondly, created something called the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Regulation that enables utilities to offer incentives to mine operators and other fleet operators as well to switch trucks from diesel and gas to cleaner burning and more cost-effective natural gas. We're looking at expanding that program today. We created the first carbon tax, I believe, in North America. It's a revenue-neutral carbon tax that puts a price on emissions. Very topical discussion given the recent election of the federal Liberals who have talked about a carbon tax. The carbon tax can be layered with other policies to create certainty for industry and promote investment in technologies that lower GHGs. Every dollar generated by the revenue-neutral carbon tax is returned to British Columbians through reductions in other taxes. Between 2008 and 2014-15, carbon tax in BC raised over $6.1 billion and returned over $7.1 billion in tax reductions for businesses, individuals, and families. So when you try to create a carbon tax that's going to be revenue neutral, you can end up, as we did, probably not charging as much or giving too much tax concession. However you want to look at it, we actually bring in less than the benefits that went back to taxpayers, which is good for taxpayers. All of these things that I just mentioned are part of our climate action plan that we started in 2007. We're now in the throes of enhancing that climate action plan. We've got something we're referring to as Climate Action Plan 2.0, which will be an enhancement of that original climate action plan. We created a team of people in BC from across the country to provide us with advice and recommendations on how we can maintain a leadership position in climate leadership. Those people are leaders from the business community, from academia, from environmental NGOs, from communities, and from First Nations. And we're going to be announcing what we're doing with our climate action plan in BC in the very near future, obviously before Paris. Let me tell you just a little bit about mining, and I love the industry, and I could spend the whole 20 minutes talking about mining, but that's not what you're all about, so I wanted to talk about renewable energy as well. But let me just spend a couple of minutes on mining in BC. We've been doing it for a long time, well over 100 years. We have a strong mining industry, and I think we have a good international reputation. We can always make it better, but it's a good international reputation. For head offices, we have a real concentration of mining expertise in Vancouver. Over 50% of mineral exploration and mining companies listed on the TSX are headquartered in BC, all of them in Vancouver. And there is, of course, this concentration of lawyers and financiers, accountants, engineers, environmental experts who specialize in mining, all located in Vancouver. We've got double the number of people working in the mining industry today that we had 14 years ago. We're up to about 30,000. We had about 15,000 in 2001. We've had good success in increasing our exploration. We measure our exploration not only in the total number of dollars that are invested, but also in the comparison of provinces in the country. It's obviously important for us to know how we're doing compared to other provinces. In 2012 and 13, there was over $1 billion invested in exploration in BC. Last year, it was $338 million. We're up to about 21% of Canadian exploration investment, which is pretty good. If you take BC and Ontario together, I think we're responsible for over half of the exploration investment that takes place in the country. Since June of 2001, despite what we all recognize as a very significant downturn in commodity prices, we actually have 8 new mines operating or under construction in BC today. So I'll just repeat that. Since 2011, we've got 8 mines in BC either operating, most of them are operating, 6 are operating, 2 of them are being built right now. Also, since June 2011, we've had 7 major mine expansions, which are extending the life of those mines, and I'm not going to name those mines, but I'm personally very proud of what we've managed to do in BC. We had, not to go partisan on you here or anything, but we had an NDP government in BC in the 1990s that really hurt our reputation, not just in Canada, but globally, and we've had to do a lot of work to earn back that reputation, and there are still people who remember the 1990s, and I spend a lot of my time out in places like this talking about what we have done to be competitive. We've got over 20 major mines and expansions currently in our environmental assessment and permitting processes. We've got up to 10 new mines that are expected over the next few years in BC. All of those new mines actually will be taking clean electricity from our grid, other than 1 and maybe 2. I wanted to say something about First Nations partnerships, because you read about First Nations activities and the relationship between the British Columbians and First Nations, between the BC government and First Nations. We're figuring out how to do business on First Nations traditional territory. It's taken a long time, and it's hard to learn things that that are brand new to you in terms of the way you were raised and the outlook that you may have. As you can tell, I'm a guy that's been around for a few years, and it took me a little while to figure out what the relationship was all about. And we don't have treaties in BC to speak of. We got one in the Northeast. It's Treaty 8. We've got a few, the Douglas treaties on Vancouver Island, tiny little treaties, but the vast majority of British Columbia doesn't have treaties. And so, in many ways, we've been forced into thinking about how we are going to deal with First Nations in terms of resource development in the province. And as difficult a process as that has been over the past 10 years, it has been a successful process and a very rewarding process, I think, for both the government and hopefully for First Nations. What we try to do is we try to develop a relationship that is no longer based on legal advice. I'm a lawyer, so I can say this without worrying too much about insulting the lawyers, but try to build a relationship with First Nations that's not built strictly on a legal de minimis. So this is, your lawyer talking, you do this much, and that's as much as you have to do. That's the way BC government's approached it for many, many years, and frankly, you don't get very far that way. You don't end up with much of a relationship, and so we've tried to build a relationship that's built on mutual trust or mutual respect and trust, and we've also tried to make sure that First Nations have the opportunity to benefit from what happens in their traditional territories, and also to be part, and this is a more recent development, to be part of the project assessment and permitting processes. It's a complicated, challenging process to make that happen. I can tell you that in my opinion, because of the fact we don't have treaties in British Columbia, and because we really have had to embrace this, I don't even want to call it a problem, it's an opportunity, we have really started to figure out how to do it. And when I read reports of other resource extraction activities across the country where you do have treaties, having treaties isn't insulation against the same kinds of challenges that we've had, for the last 20 years in British Columbia. So I think what we've learned is actually going to be valuable to other provinces, and I've had several mines ministers from across the country talk to me and say, how are you guys doing this? And we have revenue sharing. We share 37.5% of the provincial royalties from mining with First Nations whose territories these mines are in. So that's just one of the many things that we have done. Now we're aware, obviously, of commodity prices and the impact that they've had on the mining industry across the world, and that's a bit of a wet blanket on our mining industry right now, as it is, I'm sure, in the rest of the country. We're also aware of what our role is when it comes to being competitive, and that, of course, includes keeping electricity rates down, not just for the residential ratepayer, but for the industrial and the commercial ratepayer as well. Jurisdictions such as the one I'm standing in, I was born and raised in Ontario, so I'm not one of these BC people that doesn't like Ontario. I really like Ontario. Most of my relatives are still here. But you're dealing with a situation where you're trying to get off coal and perhaps nuclear, and Alberta, of course, is starting, but they're certainly making noises like they're going to be doing the same thing, and we haven't had to do that and won't have to do that in BC as long as we're smart and careful about how we manage going forward. We have something called a 10-year rates plan in BC for electricity rates that we established shortly after I was appointed 2.5 years ago. When you are spending $2.4 billion a year on capital, it requires a lot of discipline to not add additional pressure to rates. That discipline included reducing operating costs at BC Hydro. We found about $400 million over 3 years. It included a rather draconian hiring freeze and executive pay restrictions, and I'm sure that my friends at BC Hydro who are in the executive would say that those pay restrictions were also draconian, but that's what we had to do to show the public that we were serious about keeping the lid on costs, which in turn keeps the lid on rates, even though we have had to raise them somewhat. We're trying to stay on top, or not trying, we are staying on top of forecasting. We're not buying electricity we don't need. It means that I, as the energy minister, have to say no to a lot of really exciting projects, most of them renewable. Right now we have enough electricity. We actually have a little more than we need. We have a surplus. And so as much as it makes sense from a lot of different perspectives to encourage the development of these projects, right now is not the right time for us to do that, generally speaking. There are exceptions to that. We did something that I was really happy with and proud of. The government of BC actually decided to take considerably less money from its Crown Corporation than we had been taking in the form of dividends, and I'm talking hundreds of millions of dollars, tied to the rate of inflation and also tied to the debt equity ratio at BC Hydro. Private renewable power projects are extremely popular in BC. They're very popular with First Nations. When you think about the opportunity for First Nation in rural BC to have a business, a project there that's going to generate a long-term stream of revenue, very light impact on the environment. These are very, very popular projects, and I can't wait for the time when we can actually put out another call and get a bunch more of them built in BC. But again, we have to be careful in the way we manage our system and the way we manage growth. Excuse me, mining accounts for about 3,850 gigawatt hours. In BC, that's about 21% of our total industrial load. Again, electricity is a significant cost driver at the mine sites, particularly on the processing side, although companies like Teck and their 5 metallurgical coal mines in BC use electric shovels. Mines in BC don't typically stay off the grid for any other reason than they don't typically stay off the grid. As I said a second ago, they're usually on the grid. There will be always, I think, interconnection issues, and I can think of a couple of projects, maybe 3 projects, mining projects in BC, where they are just far enough away from transmission that interconnection costs are really going to be a very important component of their final investment decision, and in those cases, they may well have to consider fossil fuels or a combination of renewables and fossil fuels. There's one company that, the KSM mine in the northwest, that actually is proposing, if they build this mine, to actually use the creeks and the rivers close to the mine to generate about 20 megawatts from renewable projects, in addition to taking power off the grid. So we continue to encourage renewables in our mining sector, as we do in the other sectors. I mentioned natural gas. We've got a big program to try to encourage the people, the companies that extract natural gas to switch to electricity. Many of them are doing that. We contributed to the Sun Mine solar project. I told you that I would tell you a little bit about our own, one and only solar project that feeds into the grid. We have something called the ICE Fund. It's the Innovative Clean Energy Fund. We put $1 million out of that fund into this project. Teck also put $1 million into that project. The project is located on Teck remediated land. So the old Sullivan mine, for those of you who are in the mining industry, will remember the Sullivan mine had operated for over 100 years. And of course, there's a lot of land that's been reclaimed. And so this solar farm sits on that reclaimed land. I guess to be practical about it, and again, I think I need to mention this, when you look at the business case for the project, it's about a 1 megawatt project. You had $1 million from government, $1 million from Teck, free land from Teck, about $250,000 from another agency in the Kootenay region, and only with that setup was the project possible. So solar has a ways to go in BC. I understand that it's proving itself in other jurisdictions, and we'd like to prove it in BC as well, but it has a ways to go to, and please come and help us prove it in British Columbia. So we think that mining companies should consider the use of alternative sources in a sustainable manner as part of the solution for mines in isolated locations. You need to find the best hybrid solution to fit energy needs, location, and mine life. The project I mentioned, KSM, a second ago, will be on the grid, but Seabridge Gold is proposing to add 20 megawatts of hydro using the diverted streams close to the mine site. The benefits to companies include declining cost of renewables, increased energy efficiency, potential to lower operating costs, green tax credits, and positive effects on social acceptance of a project. I think all governments need to challenge our mining and energy sectors to collaborate on renewable solutions. We also need to continue to challenge our renewable electricity sector to develop packages for the mining industry that will provide affordable, reliable, and sustainable power options, particularly where the mine must be off-grid. Just a quick word on the current status of BC. We have decided to build the Site C project, as I mentioned. It's 1,100 megawatts of capacity. It's proven to work really well. Large hydro has proven to work very well in BC, so we're going to do it one more time. We do have a power surplus today. We do need to keep rate increases to a minimum to maintain our competitiveness in the world, and obviously the public cares a lot about electricity rates, so there's more reason than ever to try to make sure they don't go up any more than is absolutely necessary. We're enhancing our generation assets on the Peace River and the Columbia River, where we already have large storage reservoirs. That makes the most sense. And now, of course, we're adding Site C. The future of private renewable power industry in BC is still very strong, in my view. Hopefully some early opportunities will come, even though we've got a surplus of power. There are situations that will develop, particularly as the LNG industry gets up and running. And you know, I don't know what you know about the LNG industry and our prospects in British Columbia. We've got 20 projects right now that are on the books. Several of them already have federal permits to export natural gas. Obviously, with the price of natural gas, price of oil, markets are changing. The timing is not as good, but we have at least 3 very large international proponents that we believe are going to pull the trigger on their projects, and that will happen in the Kitimat, Prince Rupert area, so the northwest part of the province. And we have a radial transmission line going into Prince Rupert. Very difficult to enhance the size of that because of the terrain. So there may be some opportunities for renewable projects in that area and also in the Kitimat area. And I believe that the LNG industry will care about social license, social acceptance, and I think there's going to be some renewable opportunities that will come out of that industry. So that's essentially our story. We're fortunate, obviously, to have the heritage investments that were made in large hydro, and I'm not here necessarily to take credit for that, but I am really proud of the fact that those decisions were made, and it puts us in a very, I think, enviable position in the world. We would be foolish as a jurisdiction to drive our rates up by pushing ahead with large subsidies for renewable development. We have some subsidies and some incentives, but we have, I think, really have to be careful that we don't drive rates up in our quest to do better. There will be opportunities for the private renewable power industry. Our economy in BC is predicted to grow as faster than any other provincial economy this year. We have balanced our budget 3 years in a row. We're going to keep doing that. I don't know, I'd be interested in knowing who here is aware that BC is the only province in the country that balances its budget. Is anyone aware of that? Well, now you're all aware of it. We're really proud of that. It's not easy to do, and you know, Saskatchewan has done a great job, and it doesn't look like they're going to balance this year, but they'll balance again because they have the same disciplined approach to this. It's very, very difficult to do it, but we've done it 3 years in a row. We are one of 3 provinces that have a AAA credit rating in Canada, and you know, I don't know whether we're still going to be one of 3 or whether we're going to be one of 2 or 1 of 1. Who knows what's going to happen there. Our focus is on providing access to clean electricity to all of our sectors for the lowest possible price, and that includes mining. We know we need to be competitive. We're fortunate that we can be competitive, but we can still offer clean power to our resource industries. So that's my story. That's the story of British Columbia. I want to thank the organizers for allowing a politician to come and speak to you here this morning, and I appreciate your attention and enjoy the rest of the conference.